Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today. I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. Just so you guys know, this is the Community Outdoor Outreach Program, co-op, the grant management training. So we're going to go over everything that you need to know to actively manage your grant. So we wanted to start off with a few housekeeping things. Just so you know, this session is being recorded and will be available afterwards. It'll probably take a day or two for us to download the session, but this will be available in the resources section of Argo, and we'll go through where you can find all of that later on. If you have any questions, you can use the question tab in your little console on the right-hand side. You can type in any questions. You can either put them just to us or to the whole audience, and we do have somebody monitoring the question tab, so feel free to communicate with us that way. You all are muted during this workshop. And also, we're also going to we'll answer your questions throughout the presentation, but we're also going to have a question and answer time at the end. So you can either answer your questions now and we may or may not address them then, or we'll just have a question and answer at the end. And you can also contact us at any time if you have any questions that you want to ask offhand. We have uploaded our program guidance document and a PDF of the PowerPoint presentation that we'll be using. So you can actually find both of those documents in the handout section in this webinar. On that little console, there's a handout section. There should be 2 documents there. So just so you don't have to vigorously write down any notes, that whole the PDF of the PowerPoint is in that section for you. We are going to go through the programmatic side first. It'll take a little about an hour or so, and then we're going to take a 10-minute break and then go through all the fiscal side, which should take about another hour. So we have 2.5 hours for this presentation. This grant management training used to be much longer than that. It used to be in person. We all miss your lovely smiling faces, but we've decided to move forward with a webinar, and we're trying to condense the information down to just 2 or 2.5 hours. So bear with us in the meantime. If you have any other questions, again, feel free to reach out to us. And with that, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So normally, again, we used to be in person, so you could actually see our faces, but here's a picture of us. My name is Carly Blankenship, and I am the Co-op Grants Manager. I've been with Texas Parks and Wildlife for about 5 or 6 years now. I was the grant coordinator position back when Cappy was here, but Cappy has wonderfully retired and is enjoying her best camping life. And so now I have the grant manager role, and my contact information is here at any time. So if you ever need to reach me, please let me know. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Jessica, and she's going to introduce herself as well.
Hello, I'm Jessica Legallo, and I'm the Co-op Grant Coordinator. I've been with the co-op team for a few months now, and prior to that, I've worked with some of you before as the manager of our outdoor education and outreach programs with Interpretive Services and State Parks. So I'm excited to chat with you all today about our grant management.
Perfect. We're so happy to have you all here. So next up, we wanted to just say congratulations. You have received a co-op grantee. This is a very competitive grant program, so we really just want to congratulate you on making it through and receiving some grant funds. Looking at our list, probably almost half of you have never received a co-op grant before, and then we have some repeat people who have received grant funds. So it's exciting to have a bunch of new people on board. And we were able to distribute just over $2 million this year, which is the highest in the program's history. Hopefully it keeps growing. We will see what happens, but we're really excited to have the largest grant award to date happen this year. So we've got about 41 different grant programs that were able to receive grants this year. In case you want to see a full press release of all of the grantees who were awarded grants, you can check out our press release, and you can actually go to, if you go to our website, which you can just Google TPWD Co-op, that's the easiest way to get to our website. We have a really long URL, but you can actually go to our webpage here and go to Co-op Grants, and under the News Media section, this shows all of our different press releases for all the different programs within Rec Grants, but we're right here at the top. So you can actually read the press release, a little bit of information about the program, and then all of the different grantees who are awarded are listed here by their city and a little blurb about them all. So if you're curious about some of the other programs who receive funding, you can always go to our press release and check it out that way. All right, so again, congratulations. We're so happy to have you on board. We're going to go ahead and jump into all the programmatic side. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to include them in the question box, and we're just going to go ahead and jump right in. So just a reminder for all of you, the co-op mission is to provide grant funding to organizations for programming that engages underrepresented audiences in anything related to Texas parks and wildlife. So outdoor recreation, conservation, environmental education, is that whole realm right there. So just a reminder, that's the basis of why we're all here. And you all have definitely met that mission, which is why you're on board. So we just wanted to provide a little refresher there. And we also wanted to share some of the regulations that we have in place, some of which that we have to abide by. So unlike foundations and other private funding sources, government grants, which this is all state funds, originate from community tax dollars. So specifically for co-op, our funds are derived from a portion of the sporting goods sales tax. So anytime you're out there purchasing camping, hunting, fishing gear, kayaks, a portion of those funds actually come back and support the co-op grant program, along with some of the other departments within Texas Parks and Wildlife. Because of this, we actually need to abide by some of the required government regulations when administering grant funds to the community. So there are some things that we have to abide by. First up, we have the Texas Grant Management Standards, which is a set of financial management procedures and definitions from the state agencies, and it's what we have to follow when giving out grant money. The Texas Grant Management Standards is operated by the Texas Comptroller. So if you are ever curious, you want to see all of these guidelines, you can go to the Comptroller's website and find the full guidance there. This is kind of the state's version of 2 CFR 200. So for those people who have managed federally funded grants, they have to abide by 2 CFR 200. This is Texas's state version of that document. And anytime this document is kind of unclear on something, we defer to the 2 CFR 200. Next up, co-op was created in 1996 by the Texas legislature, and we were identified in Chapter 24 of the Parks and Wildlife Code. You don't need to know any of all this information, but all of the specifics of our statute and the reason we're here is all included in that Chapter 24 guidance. So again, you don't need to know any of that. Luckily, you won't need to memorize the specifics of any of these statutes and documents. So locally, we've created this co-op program guidance, which is found in the handout section of this webinar. And for there, we've outlined all the expectations and requirements specific to applying for and managing your grant. So the document you use to apply for the program is the same one you'll use to manage all of your grant funds as well. You can find the most up-to-date version of the program guidance in the resources section of Argo, which we'll walk you through in just a minute. And we're going to go ahead and do that now. So if you've had a grant in the last maybe 2 to 3 years, you've probably used our new Recreation Grants Online system. But if it's been a while since you've received a co-op grant, or if this is your first time, we have a brand new system that we're going to be using to communicate with you and to collect all of your documents, and that's called Recreation Grants Online. So for those who are not as familiar with this system, I'm actually going to walk you through how to use the system and how to add members and how to do some of the more administrative functions in the system. So I'm going to go ahead and log in here. First off, to get to the system, if you again go back to our web page and just Google TPWD Co-op, you can click on the Apply Manage link, and the link to the Argo system will appear here. So you can go ahead and click on that link to access our system. And then once you're in, you'll go ahead and use your username. If you do not have a username yet, whoever set up the original application will actually need to add your username to your account, or you can reach out to us and we can help create that username for you. So when you're in the system, there's a couple things that a lot of people need to do right off the bat. And the first is adding and removing members for your organization. So once you're on this home screen, you can see a couple different things. You can see your My Tasks menu, and if you have any tasks that you need to complete, they'll usually show up in this My Tasks area. And then any emails that were sent to you are usually reflected in this My Inbox section as well. But to go up and manage all of the users that fall under your grant, you can go up to the top right and click on Organizations, and all of your organization information will pop up here. If you need to update like your EIN or any of those different numbers, you can go ahead and update that information and then click Save. But to add new members and to organize members, you can click on Organization of Members, and it will show everybody that's associated with the grant. If that person has a checkbox next to their name, that means they will receive all communication with the grant. So if you see people that are listed here that do not have a checkbox next to their name, you'll need to make sure to go ahead and check that box. If you ever want to remove anybody from this list, you can either do one of two things. You could come into the active dates section here, and in this box just to the right of that, you could click in just today's date. And if you do that, any communication sent after today's date will not be sent to that person, so they will not be copied in there. Or you can just go right next to their name and uncheck their box. The most common thing you'll be doing is adding members. So if you want to add members, you can just click on this Add Members link. And then if that person already has an account in the system, you just want to link them to this application, you can do a search for that person's name, search them, and then you can link them there. But if they do not already have an account, you can go to this New Member and then fill in all this information for that person. And then you go up to the right and click Save and Add to Organization. And that person will actually receive an email, and they'll need to follow the steps on that email to get them officially set up. And so I believe they have to create or change their password from the get-go. So, and they must do that before they can have full access. So if you need to add anybody, here's where you do it. Then click Save and Add to the organization, and then have them follow the steps in the email that they receive. Next up, I wanted to show you how to find your application and all of the grant agreement documents. So from anywhere in the system, you can click on this link to Applications. And then I like to just do a blank search here, and all of the applications for your organization will appear. If you've applied for like a Trails program or a boat program, target range, those will all show up here as well. But if you have just a co-op grant, only your one co-op grant application will show up. So you'll want to click on the link under Name for whatever application that you're choosing. And then here, we call this the Forms menu. You can see all the different parts of your application. So these first 6 links are what you submitted in your proposed application, including the budget details, which we'll spend a lot more time on later. And then you can see the link for the agreement signature here. It's going to take a little while to load. And then most of you have already done this, but we also requested that you submit your AP 152 and direct deposit forms, and that was under this project elements section where you uploaded those. But this is the agreement signatures, and you can actually, if you've uploaded your agreement, you can see the link here, and that's where your agreement is found. Another thing we wanted to show you in the system, which has a lot of really great resources, is we have a resources tab that has a variety of different documents and training videos. So in the upper right, we have this Argo 2020 resources tab. You can click on there. And there's two different areas that you can manage. One is this co-op grant program resources, and any resources that are very specific to co-op are found in this section. And whenever we upload this specific training for here, we will actually upload it into this co-op section. And then you can also scroll down here and find the awarded active project resources. And here our system administrator, Blake, has created different training videos for how to sign your grant agreement or how to submit a payment request, how to submit your quarterly report, how to create an amendment. All of those have a very detailed kind of YouTube video walking you through all the steps there. So just keep in mind, if you have any questions, first check with the resources tab in the top. If you still can't find what you're looking for, you can reach out to us at any time. The next thing is that we do most of our communication out of the Argo system. And so we want to make sure that you're actually receiving those emails. If you did not receive the announcement email on March 1 that went out, it went out the morning of March 1, then we may be concerned because you're not receiving the emails. A lot of those emails will go to your spam or clutter folder, so always check those. If that's the case, you can just go in and mark those as not spam or not clutter, and so they all go into your inbox. And then some other groups, especially like municipalities or other government groups, you might have a firewall on your side preventing emails from coming through. If that's the case, we can connect you with our system administrator and he can walk your team through how to limit that firewall or how to allow our emails to come through. So we just want to make sure you're receiving all of our emails. And then timelines. Many of you have submitted all of your documents and we're working on grant agreements right now. So if you haven't already, those grant agreements should be coming through. And then it might take about a week or so after you've submitted your grant agreement for us to move you into active project. There's some things on our side we need to take care of. We need to create a PO for you, all of that kind of stuff. And so you should get moved to active project soon if you've already submitted all of your documentation. And the last thing I wanted to mention before I pass it over to Jessica is that the system uses a series of status changes. And so we're going to show you this as we go along, but the biggest thing that people forget to do is to status change things to submit them. So whenever you are, let's say, doing you're signing your grant agreement or submitting a quarterly report, submitting a payment request, whenever you're done and have clicked saved, you just need to hover over the status change link at the top and there should be a submitted thing that comes up. I'm not on a specific page, which is why it's not popping up right now. But just remember that this system requires you to status change things to submitted. And so most people often forget to do that. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Jessica, and she's going to walk you through the programmatic side.
Hello, everyone. It's Jessica. It is great to see so many of you all out there. Thanks for joining us today. The next portion of this training is going to cover and be an overview of the programmatic details related to your co-op grant. So we're going to talk about the grant agreement, the reporting requirements, and grant compliance. And then the second portion of today's training, as Carly said, is going to really dive into more of the fiscal expectations of managing your co-op grant. So if you have just your financial folks wanting to know about things like reimbursements, feel free to have encourage them to join us a little bit later on in this training. I'll also remind you that you can feel free to ask questions as we're going along, and we'll also have a Q&A session at the end. All right, so grant agreements and program expectations.
So Carly demonstrated the Argo system for you. Your grant agreement is used to outline the specific scope of work for your organization from your grant proposal. And to access your grant agreement, you would click on the applications link in the top left-hand corner of your screen and find your current grant project. And then once you click on that project, this main screen will appear. And you're going to click on agreement signatures link near the bottom. Now, if you haven't uploaded your direct deposit and AP 152 form, you've probably heard from me. But if you haven't uploaded those yet, you'll need to complete that step before we can prepare your grant agreement. So this page will include a link to that signed grant agreement near the bottom, which we'll review in just a moment, as well as the attachments linked to the agreement. So there are several uploads that we have here for you. The attachments that are included would be your approved budget, the logo use agreement that someone just asked about earlier, again, our co-op program guidance, and then a document called Assurances for State Funded Awards. So it's really important that you review all of those documents. And then this is what your grant agreement is going to look like. This would be an example of the first page. So this is the legal document used to outline your project scope and requirements. At the top, you'll see a lot of basic information like your project number and name, the period of performance, and your total grant amount. The period of performance is when all eligible grant actions take place. We'll dive into that a little bit. And then you'll also see your scope and performance goals, the total number of unduplicated participants, and then the demographic data that was part of your grant proposal. So we're going to dive into each of these separately. Let's talk about period of performance first. So your co-op grant has already started. As of March 1st, each co-op grant has a period of performance that runs 18 months. From March 1st this year to September 1st of 2023. So occasionally the universe can waylay the best of plans and grants, and we do make allowances for extensions due to circumstances like weather or most recently COVID surges. The maximum extension is 6 months, and sometimes it's just a request for another month or two to finish up some grant activities. Most situations would require an amendment, which we will also talk about today. And note that if it's just a change of venue, so let's say instead of hiking at Garner State Park, you're going to go to Enchanted Rock State Park, something like that typically does not need an amendment. So that's the period of performance for grants, 18 months. Also in your grant agreement, you will see listed your performance goals. The performance goals are listed in your quarterly reports as well, where you will describe progress throughout the grant based on these goals. And the performance goals were taken directly from your submitted grant proposal, unless we work with you to revise those goals. This section is just kind of a summary of your scope of work. Keep in mind the proposed application is part of your grant agreement. It's referenced, and you are expected to implement the project as you proposed in your application. So note that our co-op grants are very competitive, and you did receive points awarded to your organization based on those grant agreement requirements. So if you're not able to deliver the proposed aspects outlined in the agreement, you may not have received a grant during the review process. So therefore, if you aren't able to complete the project as proposed or serve the demographics that were listed in your proposal, you may not meet the terms of your grant agreement. So if it's small changes, such as, like I said, visiting a different state park, that would not be a problem. But if the primary aspects of the scope that were in your grant proposal are missing, you may be considered non-compliant. And we'll go into some compliance issues in a moment. So also part of your grant agreement, as well as the quarterly reports, are reporting on unduplicated participants. The number of unduplicated participants served and the related demographics are outlined in your formal grant agreement, and this is derived directly from the submitted application as well. Unduplicated participants would be the actual number of individual participants served, meaning if participants attend multiple events, they're only counted once as unduplicated. So the primary objective of our grant is to diversify audiences that are engaged in mission-related activities. So the participant demographics are really important in determining if we're meeting our mission and priorities of the grant. If less than 40% is listed for a particular demographic, you don't necessarily need to track or report that demographic. If 40% or greater is listed in the demographics of your grant agreement, then you're expected to serve the percentage listed as proposed. So it's important to note that you must have a means of collecting and reporting this data for the actual participants served. And you can't use rough estimates or census data. For instance, if you coordinate an after-school program and the estimated demographics in your application used the school's data, where students are recruited from, you'll need to report on the actual demographics of your own participants, as they may not necessarily match the school's overall demographics. So you're not required to submit your backup documentation when you report this. However, you must maintain these records internally in case your project is ever audited. So make sure you understand how you count unduplicated participants and what we mean by that. So we do love partnerships, and we believe that they're very important in administering programs. They can sometimes complicate some parts of programs and co-op grants. You may want to take a look at our press release that listed out this year's grantees. And if you are partnering with another co-op grant partner who is receiving a grant this year, just as you are, you'll just want to make sure that you follow a few of the rules around that. You may not provide financial resources derived from co-op grant dollars to a partnering organization that has an open grant. So I would recommend you just kind of scan that list. And this is just to make sure that some organizations aren't receiving grant funds twice from co-op grant at the same time. Also, no participants or activities should be duplicated or counted twice between the organizations. So if I'm an organization that serves Austin Public Schools, and Austin Public School also has a co-op grant, we're not going to be counting the same activities or events. It's the responsibility of the partners to determine who's going to claim a certain event in your scope of work. So for questions about anything that overlaps within projects, please don't hesitate to reach out to Carly or myself, and we'll try and provide you some clarity there. All right, let's take a look at some of the attachments that you will find in your grant agreement. It's important to review all of these. There's 4 total, and we're going to take a look at each one. So one of the first attachments you'll see is a logo use agreement. At the time that this grant agreement is signed, you'll also sign the logo use agreement, and it gives you permission to use the Proud Partner logo for any grant-related items. You could use this on brochures, on water bottles, on supplies, on your website. It's important to note that this is the only logo that you are permitted to use. Please don't use any other TPWD logos as part of your co-op grant. And we do ask that you submit a proof of the logo to co-op staff, myself or Carly, for approval before printing materials with the logo. And the logo files can be found in the resource section of Argo. Also, the upload is the co-op guidance booklet again. It's a really great quick resource in addition to the Argo tutorials, just for quick common questions about your co-op grant. So if you're wondering, can I purchase basketballs for a camp out, or can I use our bus funds to travel to the Grand Canyon? Hopefully y'all know the answers to those questions, but if you don't, I would recommend you flip through that co-op guidance book and you'll see the answer to those questions pretty quickly. The other document is assurance of state grants. These are the legal assurances and the compliance document required for organizations to receive state funds. So it is a really important document for you to look through and understand some of those compliance issues. Last but not least, in your grant agreement, you will find your approved budget. And it's very important to note this might be a little bit different than the original budget that you submitted. So the approved budget is part of your grant agreement. It's the guiding document for receiving your reimbursements and what are eligible expenses for your grant. So to access your approved budget, you would find that in your current project application. Click on that project budget details, that link, and then depending on how many items are listed in your budget, it does take a little bit to load, so be a little bit patient. And as I mentioned before, part 2 of today's training is going to be a much deeper dive provided by Carly into the fiscal management side of your grant. And it will include a deeper overview of your approved budget and the reimbursement request. So I'm just going to keep focusing on the programmatic side. So here is a good reminder of eligible and ineligible activities that are allowed. This list is provided in the program guidance document. If you were wondering about my questions earlier, we do not support traditional sports like baseball or basketball or soccer, and we also cannot support out-of-state travel with grant funds. Those are both ineligible activities. All right, lots of you have some questions around your TPWD relationships. These can be working with TPWD staff. It can be visiting TPWD sites like state parks or facilities. And we wanted to provide some tips to help you plan some of that. It's really important to plan early. Really, you should plan to plan early. Now more than ever, the capacity of our parks and sites are reaching capacity quite quickly. And this does include day passes as well as overnights and site reservations. So we wanted to let you know that online booking is available. We recommend you do it as early as possible. And this is through our new Reserve America system. I have a couple links here in this PowerPoint. Group campsites and facilities like lodges or specific youth campsites cannot be booked online. you need to work with our call center for group reservations, and that's Monday through Friday, 8 to 5. You can make or cancel reservations. You can reserve campsites and shelters, cabins, group facilities by calling those numbers. It's important to know that many parks do have dedicated group sites and facilities that can only be reserved by calling that group reservation number. And even if a park is full, sometimes those group sites may still be available. So it's important to note that group reservation number. We also have a list of accessible facilities and campsites and trails, whether that's folks that are on our trails in wheelchairs or have some type of physical disability. You can find a really comprehensive list, or you can also reach out to our accessibility team at the email that's provided. I also really want to encourage everyone to use the TPWD website calendar to find scheduled outreach programs. A lot of you are looking forward to taking part in Project Wild, Texas Aquatic Science, or Hunter Education, Angler Education. Those are all listed on our agency website calendar, and you can sign up and register for those either online or by phone. You can search by region, you can search by program, but I do encourage you to look at that calendar. And then you can also complement your visit by viewing the online calendar of interpretive programs. So if you're planning a visit to, let's say, Galveston State Park, you can look at their online calendar of interpretive programs and events. And you can also reach out to the park if you're interested in scheduling a field trip. So we do have a request form now on our website, and I listed that here for you if you'd like to send in a field trip request. Those of you that are working with Texas Outdoor Family, it's important to remember that their programs begin taking workshop reservations on February 1st for spring campouts and July 1st for fall campouts. So if you were hoping to work with Texas Outdoor Family and you wanted to camp out with them in October, you need to look for their open reservations starting July 1st, and they do book up very quickly. Be sure to sign up for their email updates, and then that way you'll get a notification when the Texas Outdoor Family programs start taking reservations. So both Carly and I are more than happy to offer additional assistance if you'd like to connect with Texas Parks and Wildlife resources or program or staff. We're really happy to make those connections and be the bridge between your organization and our agency. Start early. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about reporting requirements. Quarterly and final reports are submitted in the online Argo system. So your reports are going to include a narrative that details the progress that you're making towards achieving your grant requirements and goals, and share a list of all activities that occurred in that reporting period. So the final report is much more comprehensive for all the activities that were supported during the grant program. And again, the unduplicated participants and their demographics will be provided in each of the quarterly reports as well as the final reports. You'll see our quarterly report due dates in the quarter on this slide. So your first quarterly report will be due on July 15th. So throughout the life cycle of the grant, you'll be required to submit your quarterly reports. The reports are required no matter if you had participant activities or not. So for instance, perhaps your organization is not offering any grant activities until next school year. For this next quarterly report that's due on July 15th, that covers all activities from April to June. well, let's say you didn't really have much going on because your activities will start in September. You do still need to submit a quarterly report and just let us know that you don't have any participant activities to report. Let us know if you're having any planning meetings or need any assistance. The comprehensive final report is due no later than 45 days after the end of the grant period. But you are more than welcome to submit your final documents whenever you have completed your project activities if you would like to close out early. So those reports are really just a record of your progress, your challenges, activities that are completed. It also gives us a heads up about any activities you're planning for the next quarter, any challenges that we might be able to help you with, your participants and demographics, and then of course your TPWD relationships, whether you visited sites or worked with our agency staff or had staff trainings or anything like that. So our Argo system will automatically initiate that quarterly report for the recent reporting period. That comes on the first day of the month after that period ends. So if you look at that quarterly report schedule here, so example, the quarterly report for quarter 2 will automatically be created for your organization on July 1st, and then it is due on July 15th. So remember that if you forget maybe how to do some of these things, you can always look in that tutorial for quarterly reports under the Argo resources page. I know we're giving you a lot of information today, and come July, it might be hard to remember how to do those quarterly reports, but we do have some tutorials right here in Argo under that resource page, and they have step-by-step screenshots to kind of walk you through that process. But let's take a look at the quarterly reports, and that way you can kind of just have a general overview of what that will look like. The quarterly reports, again, they're available on the 1st of the month prior to the due date, and they will appear under the My Task section of your main screen in Argo. And on the quarterly reports, you'll be asked a series of questions. You'll be asked about your progress on your goals, any challenges you experienced during that period, or what's needed from us. And you'll need to provide a snapshot of your participants served and their demographics. And then this snapshot would reflect the entire grant period. So you can see it says proposed and then actual to date. So this allows us to kind of determine if you're on track to meet your goals by the end of the grant. So then below that, it says activities completed this quarter. You'll enter your activities listed in your performance goals. And know that in this section, you only need to include activities during the current reporting quarter. So you don't need to repeat and enter activities that you did the previous quarter. You'll list the date, the type of the activity, whether it was a volunteer day or a summer camp or after school program, the location, the number of participants served, and then what type of activities you provided. So if you've received a co-op grant in the past, this section actually replaces the former Excel activity spreadsheet that was uploaded with quarterly reports. If you coordinate a program that hosts the same type of program with the same participants, like after school program, you don't need to include each day that participants met if they're meeting daily. You can break it down weekly or monthly and then just include all your rec activities and participants that you serve during that week or that month. But if you're running a program that serves different participants with different types of activity, like one week you did an overnight camp out, and then the next week was a field trip, and then the next week was an after school Project Wild lesson, We really prefer you break those activities out separately. So, and if you have any questions on your particular program or how you should enter it, just give us a call. Don't hesitate to reach out and let us help you out. Once again, make sure you click that save button often. This has happened to me several times. It does time out if it's not saved for a while, so it's important to remember to click that save button as you're going along. All right, when you submit the quarterly report, again, make sure you click that save button. Once it is saved, we'll review that information that you've provided. If for any reason we need more information or we had questions, we will reach out to you. You'll receive an email from the system that says what item or data needs to be provided. And then once your report has been reviewed and accepted, you will receive an email confirmation indicating that there's nothing else you need to do. If you don't receive that email, then something might not have been submitted correctly. One tip that we wanted to give, again, it's that status change button. So on that quarterly report, you finished your report, you saved it, we probably haven't received it, because if you don't do the status change, we will not receive it. So again, once you complete your quarterly report, you'll receive an email verification that your report has been submitted. If you haven't received that email, chances are you probably forgot that status change button. You just go back in and then apply the status to quarterly report submitted. All right, the last thing that I'm going to talk about with y'all is a little bit about grant compliance. So as we mentioned earlier, reporting is compared to your grant agreement and your initial application that you submitted. And then we determine if all requirements have been met. So if you've been awarded co-op funds, your organization is eligible to reapply for grant funds every 2 years. If you have an extension for any reason, you would probably not be able to apply. You have to be all wrapped up and closed out. So this is make sure that your organization doesn't have multiple co-op grants going on at the same time. If you were not able to meet your grant requirements, then the grant staff will notify you during that closeout process, and you would have a scoring deduction in place when you apply for future co-op grants. So scoring deductions just make it fair for accountability, as this is a competitive grant program. And this does come out of state of Texas tax dollars. So if you're looking to avoid that penalty, things that would trigger a deduction would be not spending all of your grant funds. We certainly don't want to leave money on the table. If you leave a little bit of money on the table, that's usually not a problem. But just know that the co-op grant doesn't receive that funding back. Once it's awarded to you, if you fail to spend it, we do not see that money again. We can't transfer it to another organization or give it away the next year. So we encourage you to spend all your grant dollars. Unfulfilled project elements or performance goals in your grant agreement. Let's say you were unable to serve your target audience and didn't complete certain aspects of your scope or your goals and what you promised to do. That would also trigger a deduction in future co-op applications. If the sponsor is unresponsive to our request for additional information, not returning calls or emails could also trigger a deduction. And then, of course, if your reports are consistently missing or late or incomplete, these types of deductions would be imposed on projects closed within 2 years from that new application deadline. So we do want to make sure that you're in compliance and Carly and I are here to answer all your questions and provide whatever support you need to be successful in fulfilling your co-op grant agreement. So we'll have a little time at the end today to answer any individualized questions about the programmatic side of the co-op grant. We're going to take just about a 10-minute break before we start to dive into the fiscal expectations for your co-op grant. So in a moment, Carly will talk more about your budget and reimbursements and things like that. So the time currently is 1:53. Let's take a 10-minute break and we will start our training back up at 2:04 and dive into fiscal expectations. 2:04, a 10-minute break. We'll see you then.
And if you have any questions in the meantime, you can drop them into the question part and we'll still answer those for you. We'll see you in 10. Hello, everyone. It's 2:04, so we're going to jump back in and start with the fiscal information. And again, if you have any questions, keep them coming. There was one question which we get from a lot of different people, and I'm going to go ahead and just show you what this means. And so there was one question on searching for your application, and I'm going to pop over to Argo to show you exactly what the question is and how to resolve that issue. So somebody was asking, when you're doing the search function here to try to find your application, a lot of groups try to include all of this information. They'll include what year, and then they'll say co-op or person or year or a specific status, and then they'll try to do a search and just nobody will come up. In this case, they are, because that's just the things I did. But for a lot of people, nothing, their actual application will not show up. We recommend, most organizations only have a couple applications, and even if you have multiple applications for other programs, not that many will appear. So we actually recommend clearing out. You can actually hit the clear button here and it'll clear out that entire search category and just doing a blank search, and then all of your applications come up. Again, hardly any of you will have as many applications as we have listed here. This is our test project, so we set up projects for all of our different grant programs. Most of you will only have 1 or 2 or maybe less than 5. If you do have multiple, you just click on the co-op grant and the most recent one, usually it says active project. If your project is not active yet, if you're still signing grant agreements, it might have a different status here, but you'll just click on the most recent one that looks like it's ready to go. So that's the easiest way to search for your application, is just to clear out this entire section and just do a blank search to have something appear. So if you have any issues, that's oftentimes what it is. Let me get back to my PowerPoint here. So the next portion will be all of the fiscal requirements for your co-op grant. Not all of you have received government grants before, so you may not be aware of some of the stipulations that come with these grant dollars. I will say that state funds are a little bit easier than federal funds if you've ever had a federal grant, but there are still some things. If you're used to receiving private money or foundation money, there's just a lot more kind of red tape and requirements that we require in order to pay you funds. So we wanted to give you an overview of everything that's required, and especially for those really small organizations, we just wanted to give you a heads up about a few things that we're required or that we need to do. So just a little overview for this section. We're going to go over all the different regulations, which we already covered. We're just going to review again. We're going to go in depth on your approved budget and show you what all of those items mean. We're going to talk about amendments and budget revisions. Any sort of payment requests, we'll go through what the different types of payment requests are and how to submit them and the documentation required. Then we'll go over a budget summary report. So what's new and different about this new system is that you can actually at any time look up to see how much money you've spent in any category or just any money that you've received from the grant at any time. And you can do that. You don't have to ask us, but there's just a budget summary report that you can pull at any time. If you have any questions with that, we'll also provide you that information. And then after that, we're going to open it up for any questions that may not have been answered. And if you have any specific questions, we can go ahead and try to address those, or we encourage you to contact us after the webinar for any questions that are really specific to your grant program. All right, so just another overview about the different regulations. Again, there are more strings attached when you come with government funding. Specifically for co-op, we get our money from the sporting goods sales tax. And so every time you purchase camping, hunting, fishing gear, kayaks, all of that equipment, we get a portion of that back. So we are required to abide by some of the government regulations when giving money to different grantees. And the first of those is Texas Grant Management Standards. This is the financial management procedures and the definitions provided by the Texas Comptroller, and the full Texas Grant Management Standards document is on the Comptroller website. You do not need to know all the ins and outs of that document, but everything like cost principles and specific procedures that you have to follow are listed within that document. It's essentially the state or the local version of 2 CFR 200, which is the federal grant guidelines. This is the state grant guidelines. And then also Chapter 24 of the Parks and Wildlife Code outlines, is essentially our statute creating our program. And so it will outline the purpose and intent of the grant program. Again, you won't need to know that, just know that we have to follow certain things that are included in that wildlife code. So it's something as specific as the demographics we serve are listed in that code. So we can't serve different demographics that are not listed in that code. So it's why we have our underrepresented audiences are as they are, because they're in our code. And last is the co-op program guidance. You won't need to memorize those top two things. We've condensed some of that information into our co-op program guidance to make it easier to digest, but just keep in mind that those other things are what we have to refer to for the more in-depth requirements. So our co-op program guidance is in the handout section. It's also in the resources section of Argo. So any questions on eligible or ineligible activities or expenses, what documentation is required for payments, all of that information is found in our program guidance document. All right, so we're going to start off with the approved budget. And your approved budget is part of the grant agreement and is the guiding document for receiving payment of all of your eligible expenses. So I'm actually going to walk you through your approved budget in Argo. So bear with me while I switch screens here. And again, go to that applications page and search for your actual application right here, and make sure to click on the link under name, not under organization. Otherwise, it'll bring you to the organization's information and not the actual application information. So once you get on this main form screen, you just look for the project budget details form here. Keep in mind that if you have a lot of line items on this budget, it will take a little bit to load. It might take a minute or two to load. My example one only has a couple line items, so it loads super quick. I did that on purpose, so you guys didn't have to wait around for me. But typically for you guys, you tend to have a lot more items listed on here, so it might take a minute or two to load. Don't refresh or anything, just wait for it to fully load. So this is what your approved budget should look like in the system. So we have things broken out to personnel and fringe, food and travel, fees, outdoor service projects, supplies. In my example budget, I only have 3 line items for personnel because I wanted to make it simple, but you guys will probably have a bunch of supplies listed out here, maybe a bunch of fees, maybe a bunch of food and travel. So your budget is going to look a little bit different. When we actually approved your grant, we went in and we included this approved TPWD cost column. So just keep in mind that there may have been some expenses that were disallowed from your project. And if that was the case, let's say you requested an outdoor shed, which we cannot allow for the co-op grant. If that was the case, we left outdoor shed listed on your budget, but then we just put a 0 under approved TPWD cost. So just keep in mind that if you see a 0 there, that means it was disallowed and you will not be able to seek reimbursement. It might still be listed on your budget, but there must be an actual dollar value, not 0, listed in the approved TPWD cost column. In addition, some of our staff may have consolidated some of your line items. So a lot of projects, when you're applying for it, especially in supplies, you might list all of your individual supplies for a specific activity. So if you're going rock climbing, you may have climbing ropes, harnesses, carabiners, helmets, etc., all listed out on individual line items. In order to simplify things down the road, especially for our auditors on the back end, we In many cases, we went in and actually consolidated those individual line items to instead read something like rock climbing supplies and related. So you might not see those broken out individually. We may have gone back and just done a blanket line item for rock climbing supplies. This helps you in the long run because let's say you didn't have carabiners listed out and you just want to buy a $5 carabiner for your project. If it wasn't on your approved budget, we wouldn't allow it. But now that we've added in a general rock climbing supplies line item, now that would be allowed. It also helps our auditors on the back end so that they don't have to search through 100 different line items listed here when they're making sure that the item is on the approved budget. If they just see a general rock climbing supplies line item, it's a lot easier for them on the back end. So just keep in mind that you may have seen that we condense some of these line items into more general lines. Then at the bottom, you'll also see the total grant funds requested is what you initially put in the application, and then there should be a total grant funds approved line item as well. If you had any disallowed activities, the approved line item will be less than the requested line item. There's also a TVWD staff notes section here, so if there's any disallowed items, then we actually remove those from your budget. In addition, if you have put any match or sponsor contribution in your budget, we actually removed these from the awarded budget. And there's a couple reasons why we did this. If you did that, we also included a note in this section that your sponsor contribution was provided in the application, but we removed it because you're not required to report on any sponsor contribution. So in the past, if you had put sponsor contribution in here, you received points based off of how much sponsor contribution or in-kind contribution you were providing. That is no longer the case. So now that's not part of our scoring criteria. Some projects will only list the projects that they're seeking funding for. So because that's not part of the scoring requirement, we do not require you to report any match or sponsor contribution. In fact, it eases a lot of burden on our auditors because then they don't have to approve or review all of your sponsor contributions. So when it comes down to actually providing payments, no need to include any sponsor contribution in that section. Hopefully that will help ease some of your administrative burden as well. And then the last thing I wanted to show you on your approved budget is if you go to the top here, there is a button that has print version. If you would like a PDF of your approved budget at any point in time, you can click on that print version and it will actually generate a PDF of your approved budget, which will look like this. It's a little bit harder to read, but it is a PDF of your approved budget. Keep in mind that as you do certain budget revisions, that PDF obviously will no longer be up to date. So we always refer people to the actual approved budget part here because whenever you do a budget revision, we'll go ahead and change these actual dollar amounts on the approved. So this portion of the budget is always the most up to date for your project. All right, next up, I'm going to go talk about amendments, and I'm going to go back to our PowerPoint here. All right, amendments. This is a common question we get for all projects, and there are 3 different amendment types for every program. Some of them are more common than others. So we first have grant extensions, then a change in project scope, or a budget revision. For extensions, you will have the opportunity to extend your grant period for an additional 6 months. So your original grant award is actually for 18 months. It goes from March 1 of 2022 until September 1 of 2023. You will, as long as you're compliant with everything and you've provided all your reports, you will have the option of submitting a request to extend your grant for an additional 6 months. Unfortunately, we cannot expand it longer than 6 months. These are state funds, and these state funds will actually expire on our side within the biennium. So we actually have a deadline for when we can spend these funds, and so after a certain deadline, we can no longer spend these funds. So we will not extend it past that additional 6 months. So keep that in mind. Also keep in mind that an extension grant or extension amendment must be fully executed, meaning it's signed by both parties before the original period of performance date ends. So it has to be fully executed in order to be valid. So we'll send you a reminder probably about 2 or 3 months before the end of your grant period. And we'll just check in to see, hey, if you need an extension, we need you to go ahead and request that extension now. We usually don't process extensions until about three or so months before the project expires, so you can't go ahead and extend right now. We want to wait to see where you're at with the project closer to the end of the performance period to actually extend your grant. But it will need to be fully executed in order for your grant to be extended. The next type of amendment is a scope change, and scope change amendments are very rare and primarily for significant changes in your project scope. So if your entire grant was focused just on mountain biking, but now you want to change it so that it's an archery or camping program or something that's just completely different than what was proposed, you would need a scope change and amendment. And again, these are really rare. I've only done maybe a couple of these in the 5 or 6 years that I've been here. We just don't do these very often. Keep in mind that removing key grant agreement requirements may not be approved, such as removing service projects, changing from a year-round program to a one-time experience, or reducing required demographics. This is a very competitive grant program, so staff need to evaluate if the proposed change that you want to make would have been scored roughly the same as when it was initially reviewed, because if it would have been scored a lot less, you may not have received a grant in the first place. So typically we do not change your grant agreement requirements unless there was something really special that took place. You know, COVID has been a whole thing where we had to work with project sponsors to completely amend their grant agreement, or with, let's say, Hurricane Harvey really changed a lot of projects, and so maybe all of their project activities took place at Galveston Island State Park, and now that park is closed, and so you need to completely rethink what you're doing. Those are the types of cases that we do these. It's not typically if, hey, I'm probably not going to serve these demographics. We would still require you to serve those demographics. If you want to make minor changes to your scope, such as changing like locations or adding additional similar programming or just moving your timeline around, things are running behind, no amendment is required. It's always best practice to consult Jessica or myself to see if your changes require an amendment and if they're allowed. So if you have any doubt at all, feel free to contact Jessica or myself. And then last are budget revisions. These are by far the most common amendment and are the only amendment type that does not require signatures from all parties to be approved. So you would still need to request the budget revision or amendment in the system in Argo, but we don't need you to sign a whole new grant agreement just for these budget revisions. So if you want to purchase an item that is not currently listed with a dollar amount on the approved budget, you'll need to request this budget revision. And in this case, you request it, and then we actually just go in and change your actual approved budget in the system to reflect whatever change you're doing. So I'm going to take a deeper dive into budget revisions, since these are by far the most common type of amendments that we process with grantees. So a few tips to keep in mind that unfortunately, I wish we could, but we cannot. Your total grant award will not increase with a budget revision. So we cannot award you more money. Again, competitive grant program, we only have a certain amount of funds that we work within, so we just don't increase dollar amounts. So when you're requesting that budget revision, make sure to include which existing line item will be decreased to offset the cost of that budget revision. Also, if you're just reallocating funds from one existing line to another, you do not need an amendment or any sort of approval. So let's say you have both kayaks and tents listed on the budget, $10,000 for kayaks, $10,000 for tents. You you realize that you don't need as many kayaks as you thought, so you only purchased 5,000 in kayaks, but you're like, oh, but we need more tents. You can go ahead and purchase more tents since it was also already on your approved budget. You don't need any sort of amendment there or any sort of approval from that. So if you want to purchase more of a line item that's already listed on your budget, you can just go ahead and do that. We know that things change, you know, certain things go on sale, whatever happens. So as long as those items are listed on your budget, you can go ahead and make that change. If you're making a significant change with moving money around, like let's say you're not purchasing most items on your budget and you just want to purchase all funds with one line item on your budget, it's really best case to reach out to Jessica or myself first, because we'll want to know some additional information behind that and really kind of reevaluate if that's okay. So if there's really significant changes of moving money around on your budget, go ahead and reach out to Jessica or myself. The last thing is it's highly recommended to request a budget revision before the item is purchased. There's no guarantee that we're going to approve that budget revision that you're requesting, so it's best practice to add it to the budget first to ensure your organization won't have to eat the cost later on if it's not approved. So remember, the item must be added via budget revision before you request any sort of reimbursement. Our auditors, when they're looking through a reimbursement, need to confirm that all items are listed on the approved budget. So we would need to make sure to complete that budget revision before any sort of reimbursement request was provided. All right, so next up, I'm going to walk you through how to actually create a budget revision in the system. So let me go back over to Argo here and I'll walk you through this process. All right, so with everything, just make sure you go back to the Applications tab. It's going to take a minute. And then search for your current application. And then if you want to submit an amendment request, any of those different type of amendments, you all start the same way. You would just hover over from this main forms menu, hover over the status change button near the top, and then click Amendment Revision Request in Process. And just apply that status. Once you apply that status, you will have a new amendment revision request pop up here. If you have done an amendment revision request in the past, it's going to show up as you have 2, and then 2 are going to pop up here. So you'll want to make sure to click on the newest one. So I did a test one earlier that I canceled. So we'll need to make sure that we click on this the second one listed, whatever date is the furthest date, the closest to now. So you would just click on that link. A couple things to remember when you initiate an amendment request, so it's not even submitted yet, but you at least put it into, you change the status to amendment revision request in process, you will not be able to submit a reimbursement request when it's in this stage. So reimbursement documents are calculated using the approved budget, and when you begin an amendment, you're requesting to change the budget. So that way, we can't allow any additional reimbursement processes to go through while it's an amendment. So therefore, the amendment must be fully completed before you can submit your next either reimbursement request or advance request. So typically, especially with budget revisions, it's a really quick process. I'll usually create the budget revision within the same day or the next day, so it's pretty quick. If you need to do an extension or a scope change, those require signature, so those could take a couple extra days because we need our director to sign, and we also need the authorized person from your organization to sign those as well. So just keep that in mind. When you get to this form, then you'll just select what type of revision or amendment or revision request you're doing. So most case scenario, it's going to be add budget item. You would just include the budget item that you're adding here, along with its associated costs, and then let us know which existing line item will be reduced to offset the costs. And so this is so that we know where to actually reduce the funds from, since we can't add extra money. So you would just briefly describe that here, give a very brief explanation of why it's necessary. We don't need a novel here. It can be very short and sweet. So include that information here, then make sure to click Save in the upper right-hand corner. And then if you're, let me submit some text here so it doesn't give me error message. If you don't complete one of these boxes, you will get this error message at the top. And then once it's saved properly, you'll just hover over the status change button and move it to submitted. And once you actually status change it to submitted, you apply the status, that's when we get the notification. So just make sure with all of these different steps, you click the status change button. If you accidentally initiated an amendment because you just wanted to see what it looks like, or you just accidentally hit that button and you want to cancel that amendment, you can just hover over the status change button and then go to amendment revision request canceled, and it will put your project back into active project. So you have full access to do that at any time. So then once you submit that amendment to us, then we will review it and then we'll either approve it or deny. And if it's either a scope change or an extension, it'll need to go through the application process or the signature process. But if it's a budget revision, then we will actually go in and make the changes directly to your budget, and then we'll finalize and complete that amendment. So you'll get notifications all along the way showing if it was either approved or denied. All right, let me go back over to, actually, I'm going to go ahead and cancel this amendment so that I can later show you how to submit a payment request. And now I'm going to go back over to our spreadsheet here. All right, as a reminder, I just wanted to show you some of the non-allowable expenses for co-op grants. As a reminder, all of these are listed in your program guidance document. So if you have any questions on if certain items are not allowed, just refer back to your program guidance. That has all the information you need to know. A few of the common items included are marketing materials, which are not allowed, construction expenses, prizes certificates, sales tax, which sales tax is by far the most disallowed item. So if you have sales tax on there, because these are government funds, you need to make sure to deduct that sales tax amount from any receipt that you submit. And then if you're seeking reimbursement for an item that's not listed on your budget, it will not be approved. So that's going to be disallowed as well. Or if you did not provide the adequate documentation for expenses that you're requesting reimbursement for, that will be disallowed as well. So some of those are the most common disallowed expenses that we see. So always refer back to here. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to give us a holler. And next, we're going to go into the payment types. There's some information in this section, which is a lot different than previous co-op grants. Hopefully it's better for you and it makes it a little more convenient. So I just wanted to go over some of those changes and then just talk about the two different types of payments that we have available. So first up are reimbursements. These are the most common payment type, and most people will do a reimbursement request. In this scenario, you would actually purchase the items first, then submit a reimbursement request to us with all of the required backup documentation, and we'll go over what that backup documentation is. Once the documentation is approved, TPWD will actually pay you the funds after the fact. So you will need all of those funds up front, and then we'll pay you after they've been purchased and after we've approved your backup documentation. You can submit as many reimbursements as needed towards your grant, so you can do it as often as you need. However, a pending reimbursement must be fully processed by our fiscal team before you can submit the next reimbursement request. So you can't go ahead and submit reimbursements back to back to back. Our fiscal team actually needs to approve that reimbursement and then send it to the next step all the different stages of payments before you can submit your next reimbursement. You can actually start the next reimbursement and get it all ready to go. You just can't hit the submit button until your prior reimbursement has been processed. The next type of payment is an advance fund, and these were formerly known as seed money. So this is really helpful for smaller organizations that might have kind of tighter cash flows and challenges related to cash flow. So again, they were formerly known as seed money requests, and a few changes have been made to the process from previous grant rules. So we're going to go over that a little bit. Projects might be using these advances more often, especially those kind of smaller organizations. So in this scenario, you can actually request an advance payment and TPWD will pay you the advanced amount up front. Then once the expenses have been purchased and you purchase that full amount, you will provide the required backup documentation to the entire advanced amount on the back end. So it's essentially the reverse process of a reimbursement. We'll pay you the money first, and then you'll go in once those items have been purchased and provide all of the backup documentation just like you would a reimbursement. It's important to know that advances should not exceed the amount of expenses to be incurred within 3 months of the date of the advance request. So we will not give you the full amount of grant funds if you're doing a year-long project. We will not give you the full amount up front. It is just for up to 3 months of expenses. And the reason being is we want to make sure that you're able to fulfill all of those expenses. So we do it in kind of smaller pots. There's no specific dollar amount cap on the amount that you can request in advance, as long as you've estimated that those expenses will be incurred within 3 months of the request date. All backup documentation must be received and approved for the full amount of these advance funds before you can request any additional reimbursements or advances. So just keep in mind, similar to reimbursements, you can only have one pending at a time. So you must fully fulfill all the backup documentation, meaning you've provided all of those receipts and proof of payment for all expenses that were incurred before you can request either another reimbursement payment or an advance payment. So one big new thing this year, which I think a lot of you will really like, is the former rules stated that you could only receive one advance payment at the beginning of the grant. It was formerly known as a seed money request. This is no longer the case. So now you can receive multiple advances throughout the lifetime of the grant. But remember that all backup documentation must be received and approved by TPWD before you can submit the next one. So just like reimbursements, you have to fully approve and provide all backup documentation for one advance before you can go in and submit another advance request. But you can have, once that's fully satisfied, you can go in and submit another request for an advance. If you can't spend the full amount advanced, or you fail to provide backup documentation for all advance funds received, you must repay any unused funds back to the agency. And just so that you guys know, this process is a little cumbersome for us. We have to go up and find some specific information that you need to include on the payment back to us. And then we have to go searching for those funds when they hit our agency, because they don't always tie back. So it's really cumbersome on us. So really try to avoid this situation. If you submit an advance request, let's say near the end of your grant, make sure that you're actually going to spend all of those funds. Or maybe at the end of the grant, it might be better to do a reimbursement so that you know exactly how much money you're requesting. So just be careful that you don't request too many advance funds that you're not going to be able to purchase. A few things to remember. So as a reminder, all items must be listed on the approved budget to be allowed for grant payment. If the item is listed on the budget but has $0 listed in the TPWD approved column, this means the item was disallowed or it's not part of the approved budget. So always make sure there's a dollar amount listed there. Also, this one's really important. Remember that it can take up to 30 days to process a payment request on our end if all the proper documentation was received. If our auditors need to request any additional information that was missing from your reimbursement request, the process can take longer than that 30 days. So just keep in mind, there is a wait time. Sometimes it takes longer, sometimes it can occasionally take longer, sometimes it can be much shorter. It all depends on the backlog of what we're facing. We have, what, 5 or 6 different grant programs within our agency and only a few auditors. So just keep in mind that it can take up to 30 days to process a payment for you. Also keep in mind that if you submitted your direct deposit information at the beginning of the grant, your payment will get to you much quicker. If we need to send you a check, it usually takes probably about a week longer for that check to be issued and then to be mailed and sent to you. So direct deposit payments are always much quicker. Requests for payment should be submitted on a regular basis, preferably quarterly if expenses were incurred during that quarter. You don't have to do it quarterly, but we just recommend that if expenses were incurred. We want to see progress on all of your expenditures throughout the life of the grant, and we want to make sure you're on track. And it's also really difficult for our auditors to complete one big reimbursement request and process that at the end of your grant because there'll be so many different line items. It takes a lot longer to process. So that's why we want to make sure that you do reimbursement requests throughout the lifetime of your grant. Also, leaving significant amounts of money left on the grant could lead to scoring deductions if you're going to apply to the grant in the future. Just because co-op does not receive that funding back, just like Jessica mentioned earlier. If you don't spend all of that money, we can't move that money to a different project or use it in the future. It actually goes back to the general fund, and legislators might question of, hey, you wanted this amount of money, but you couldn't spend it all, so why should we give you more money in the future? So just keep in mind, try to spend as much money on your grant as possible. And then the last tip is that all payment requests must be submitted via the Recreation Grants online system, so via Argo. And I'll walk you through in just a little bit on how to actually do that in the system, but we will not accept any sort of payment requests that are outside of the system. So you must do it within the system. It also helps trigger things as far as like future budget summary reports. So that's why we need it all in our system. All right, so what's required when submitting a payment request? And this is both for a reimbursement and an advance. Just on the advance, you'll be doing this on the back end. So the same amount of information is needed no matter what type of payment you're requesting. So you must provide 2 primary types of backup documentation for every single expense incurred to prove the item was purchased. So depending on the expenditure, you'll need a receipt, invoice, or work record. So that's the first thing that you'll need. And work records, another name for this is a timesheet. Timesheet and work record is the same thing. And the second thing you'll need for every single item is proof of payment for each item purchased. And we'll go over really what this details in just a minute. But just keep in mind that on page 13 of your program guidance, we outline all of this information in detail about what information you need, what are the types of, what counts as proof of payment, what is needed in your receipt, invoice, or work record. That's all outlined in your program guidance document. But we will go over that information now. All right, first up is receipts. So a photocopy of the receipt must be provided with your backup documentation. Each receipt must contain at a minimum the date of purchase, vendor name, an itemized list of purchases, and the amount paid for those expenses. All receipts must be legible for review, so if it's been torn or part of it is missing or the ink has faded, you may not receive reimbursement for that expense. Because this is a government grant program, sales tax is not eligible for reimbursement, so make sure to reduce or deduct the amount of sales tax that was listed on that receipt. Sales tax is by far the most common thing that we have to remove from all requests. And finally, all items must be itemized on the receipt so our auditing staff can confirm the purchase of each requested item. So make sure it's fully itemized. The state's cost principles are followed for all expenditures. So as a summary, the cost must be necessary and reasonable, be allowable as described in the grant agreement, and must be allocable to a particular cost objective. So it must be tied to a specific activity. For a full description of cost principles, you can either refer to the program guidance document, which we've provided a little bit of information in there, or you can see the full cost principles information in the Texas Grant Management Standards document found on the Comptroller's website. So next up are contractor invoices. So receipts were the first thing, now our invoices. And you can have a variety of different contractor invoices here, but payment for independent contractor costs requires an invoice from the actual contractor. So common contractors for co-op grants include guides that assist with events, contract staff, and so on. There's a lot of different invoices here. Invoices must include the amount paid to the contractor, a description of the service provided, the date of services rendered, and the taxpayer identification number. For individuals, if you're paying an individual like a guide or something like that, the taxpayer identification number will actually be their social security number. Like all other transactions, proof of payment is also required along with the invoice. If invoices are new to your organization and you're looking for an example, you can contact our grant staff and we can actually send you a standard template for an invoice. We've got a few templates that we can send you. The one listed here is a really good example of a standard template because it has all the information required. So if this is brand new to your organization, don't worry, we can provide you with some example templates. All right, paying your personnel. So payments for personnel within your organization require work records, otherwise known as timesheets. You might refer to those as timesheets. So timesheets must include the employee's name, hours worked, hourly pay rate, total amount paid to the employee, fringe benefits, if any, and should be signed by the authorized supervisor. Like all other transactions, proof of payment is also required when submitting a personnel request. For those organizations who have never received a government grant in the past, this is definitely a government grant rule that you must have all this information in a timesheet. So these are often new for groups who have never received a government grant before. You're not required to use the template listed here, our weekly work record, as long as all the information required is provided on whatever timesheet that you have. But if you need a template, we're happy to provide you one again. So it's much better to have these timesheets in place at the beginning rather than submitting a reimbursement request and you realizing that you did not have these in place and you have to go back and it's a whole mess. So if you do not currently use timesheets in your organization and personnel is included on your approved budget, you will need to make sure to get a timesheet in place and make sure all of these items are included on your timesheet. And again, we can provide you a template. All right, so we covered the receipts, invoices, and timesheets, and now we're going to cover the proof of payment part. So again, proof of payment is needed for every single expenditure that you will purchase towards the grant. Proof of payment may vary depending on the form of payment used. So we're going to go through all of these different forms. Again, this is all covered in further detail in the program guidance document on page 13. So you can always look at that page for reference. But the following proof is required for each of these types of transactions. So if you had a transaction that was paid with a check, then you will need to provide a digital check copy from the bank showing the amount paid, or a copy of the non-canceled check with the bank statement showing the check cleared the account. You'll need one or of those items. If you used a P card, which is a purchase card, or a debit or credit card, then you will need a copy of the statement showing the charges. If you paid with a credit card, you'll also need a copy of the canceled check paid to the credit card company showing that you paid off the charges at the end of the month. If you're using petty cash or gift cards, these are allowed, but really not recommended. We highly do not recommend any of these. It's a lot harder to show the paper trail on the back end, so we just really don't recommend these. But itemization for cash being withdrawn from petty cash is required, as well as the digital check copy showing the funds have been replenished. It's important to know that if your organization received donated gift cards, then the expenses purchased with those donated gift cards are not eligible for reimbursement. This would be double dipping. Essentially, you would have got 2 donations for the same item, and so you would not be able to do that. I will say up front that I am not an auditor. I'm not the one who's going through all of your reimbursements. Jessica and I are on the programmatic side. So if you have any specific questions on documentation needed on any of these, we highly recommend you contact our audit staff, and you can send an email to us and we'll connect you with the audit staff. We also have all of the audit staff listed on our webpage under the staff contact information, so you can go there as well. But Jessica and I will be your main contact for so many things. Feel free to just reach out to us and we can connect you with our auditors. All right, a few more different types of payments, and then we'll move on to actually showing you how to submit the reimbursement request. So if you're paying with personnel funds or personal funds, so employees and volunteers may purchase items that are located on the approved budget and be reimbursed for those expenses. We have to ensure that everything is routed through the awarded entity. So the grant sponsor must pay those individuals first, then seek reimbursement from TPWD for those expenses. So documents required for this type of reimbursement include a copy of the original receipt that that employee or volunteer purchased, or that invoice from the purchase, as well as proof of payment from your organization to that individual to cover those costs. So we'll need to see that complete trail of paperwork showing that they purchased it and that initial receipt, plus a proof of payment that you actually paid that individual, and then we will reimburse you for those expenses. So everything must be routed through your particular organization that we have a grant agreement with. A question that we've also received from other people occasionally was, can we just send you an invoice of something we purchased and you pay them directly? We will not do that. Again, we will either do an advance request or a reimbursement request. Everything has to be routed through your organization. You're the one who we have a legal agreement, a grant agreement with, and so you are the only one that we will pay. Lodging. So if lodging from a hotel or camp facility is listed on the approved budget, you may seek reimbursement for those expenses. Receipts must include the date of stay, nightly rate, number of rooms used each night, the hotel location and contact information, and must show a zero balance on the receipt or some type of proof of payment. Like all the other expenses, you will also need to show proof of payment for this. So you'll need the actual receipt and invoice from the whoever you purchased lodging through, plus proof of payment that we covered just a second ago. Unlike most other expenditures, hotel, state, and local tax is allowable for hotels, since they will not waive these even if you're a tax exempt organization. So just keep in mind that we can pay you for those hotel, state, and local taxes. Lodging such as Airbnb or VRBO or any of those other sites like that are allowed. However, the information listed here still must be on the receipt. So all the information that we required still must be there. Plus the rates of lodging must be considered reasonable. So you cannot get a really fancy hotel. These are our government grant dollars. We have to be responsible for those. So we need to make sure it's an actual reasonable rate for those. You know, that's probably close to the standard government rate for hotels. And travel. So if listed on the approved budget, your organization may seek payment for travel expenses. Rental vehicles, bus transportation, gas, and mileage payments are all allowed as long as they are listed on your approved budget. Keep in mind that you may not claim both gas and mileage for the same travel, as this would be considered double dipping for the same expense. So it either needs to be gas or mileage. TPWD uses the current federal mileage rate when reimbursing for mileage, which can change on an annual basis. So you can always look up the current federal mileage rate on the IRS website, and that rate tends to change every single year, usually at the beginning of the year. So whenever we're paying for what date it is, just make sure that that current rate of pay is being used. I can't remember now, it's either 55 cents or 56 cents per mile. I can't remember what the actual approved IRS rate. I think it recently changed. To receive payment for mileage, a mileage log is required, which includes the name of the traveler, date of activity, number of miles driven per day, the relevant grant-related activities, and the starting and ending points for that travel. So make sure that you have some sort of mileage log when requesting that. All right, we've gone through all those individual expenses. We're getting near the end, y'all, so just be patient. We have a few more things to cover, but I wanted to walk you through actually submitting a payment request in our system. So now I'm gonna bring up the website again and actually walk you through. Hopefully it has not timed me out again. All right, it hasn't. So again, search for your application in this function, your most current application. If you are in the amendment status, so amendment in process or amendment processing or something like that, just keep in mind that you will not be able to submit a reimbursement request. So if that's the case, you'll either need to fully execute that amendment or you'll need to cancel that amendment if you didn't realize that you were in that stage. So one way you can tell that is you can actually hover over this yellow arrow here and it will show you what status you're in. For the most part, you should always be in the active project status. Actually, none of you are in active project right now because we're still getting all of your grant agreements set up. But once the grant agreement is signed and we've created a PO and everything on our end, you will get moved to this active project. So if you look at this and it shows that you're an amendment in process, you will not be able to initiate a grant payment. So from this page, to initiate a grant reimbursement request, you would just hover over the related documents and messages, and you will see something here that says initiate a payment reimbursement request. So if you just click on that request, oh, sorry, I've already done this. So typically, I already have a payment, it's okay. I already have a payment in process, so you guys would actually initiate this, but I'm going to show you what it looks like on the end. And you don't normally have the second thing that pops up here, so I'm going to go ahead and click on that to show you what it looks like. But for you guys, you will all, either for an advance or a reimbursement request, you would click on the initiate a payment reimbursement request, and then it will bring you to this screen. And so you'll see the actual payment reimbursement request listed here. If you initiate that and you need to come back to it, also keep in mind that you can just go to your home page here and there will be a task listed under My Tasks area that says Payment Reimbursement and Process. So you can also go here to click and complete your payment request. So I'm going to go ahead and click on it and walk you through what it looks like. So a lot of this information up here will automatically populate. You'll just need to make sure to complete whoever the fiscal contact is. So if there's any questions, we need to make sure who that contact is so that we can contact them and ask these questions. If you choose a name from this drop, they have to be linked to your organization and have an account in here. So whoever you choose here, this is a required field and they must be within your organization. And then you'll go ahead and include the service period. So this is, the service period is the range of dates that you're seeking reimbursement for. So if you have payments through a 3-month period of time, you'll want to make sure that it's through that full 3-month period of time. And then just like previous reimbursements, if you've had a grant before, we used to have a separate spreadsheet that we filled out. Now that spreadsheet is found directly in Argo. So Similar to that, it's all done directly within this payment request form. So you can go ahead and just start filling out the information for all of these items. So you must complete a line item for each receipt, invoice, or work record being requested here. So if you, let's say, give an example, let's say you have an REI receipt. And that REI receipt has 30 different camping and fishing supplies listed on that receipt. You do not need to enter a new line item on here for every single item purchased on that REI receipt. Instead, you will just list that one REI receipt here and include all the information from that one receipt. So this spreadsheet is really based on the receipts or work records or invoices that you provided, rather than all of the itemized individual things listed on each receipt. So when completing this, you'll need to make sure that you list what activity or description of what was purchased here, the date of the purchase, the vendor, so if it's an REI receipt, you would include REI here, the date of the invoice or receipt. If there's an invoice number or some sort of reference number, you can include that reference number here, and then list what type of payment. So if it was paid with a check versus a P card, which that includes like debit or credit cards, you would mark how it was paid there. And then you would do a payment reference number. So let's say you paid with the check, you would put the check number listed here. And then you would choose which category that you that is linked to those receipts. So often it's supplies or personnel. You would just choose from this drop box. And then you would choose the amount that is requested for this particular grant. And I'm going to come back to that, but you can ignore these lines for sponsor retainage and sponsor match. Like we mentioned earlier, we do not require any sort of in-kind contribution or sponsor contribution or sponsor match or overmatch. We do not require any of that. And in fact, we don't even want to see the backup documentation for that. So you will not need to include any of your in-kind expenses for co-op grants in this section. Now, if you have a different grant with us, let's say through the local parks program or trails or target range, they do require that. This is specifically for co-op grants. You do not need to include any dollar amount or provide any backup documentation for match or in-kind contributions. So then you would just list the requested amount here. If you're only seeking payment for a portion of the items purchased on that receipt, then you would only include the total amount of the receipt that counts towards this grant in the requested amount box here. If that's the case, you must also highlight or mark on the actual receipt which items are being requested as part of this grant, so that we know which items we're reviewing versus which items we're not reviewing. Just a heads up, as many of the areas in the system, this can take a while to complete. So especially if you have a bunch of different receipts you're putting here, it will time out on you. So make sure to hit the save button many, many times throughout the process. You know, every couple expenses you put in, just go ahead and hit the save button. Because I haven't completed this information, it's going to give me some errors, but just save frequently. We've had several people who tried to fill out everything at one time, and then they hit save and it timed out and they lost all that information. So just save frequently. And then the second part to a payment request is the backup documentation required. So as mentioned before, the backup documentation includes the invoice, receipts, work records, as well as proof of payment for each expenditure. So you'll need 2 different things for every item purchased. Unfortunately, you're not able to upload each document individually in our system. We only have one upload button here for you. Our system is limited in this capacity, so only the last receipt would actually appear on our end if you uploaded multiple. So instead, you should actually merge all of those PDF documents into one PDF. So merge it all together and then upload that one PDF into this section. Once all sections of this form are complete, make sure to hit save one last time, and then you will actually hover over the status change button and select Apply Status for Payment Reimbursed Submitted. It will not get into our queue for the auditors until you actually hover over the status change and click Submitted. I believe you'll actually receive an email confirmation saying that it was submitted, but you'll just want to make sure to complete that step. Once completed, our fiscal auditing team will receive notification to review your request. If additional clarification or backup documents are needed, an email will be sent requesting the additional information through the Argo system. So to ensure that all requests make it into the review queue and to protect private information included in the request, payment requests should all be in the Argo system. So we will not collect anything outside of the Argo system. All right, so next up are advanced payment requests, and I'm actually going to keep it on here. Advanced payment requests are going to be very similar to reimbursements, so you would initiate that this whole thing just like we did, fill out the fiscal information, include the service period, and again, the service period will just be the 3-month period of time from the date that you're requesting. And then since you will not have specific itemized line items purchased, you will just include in this activity line item description something that says advanced requests. You can also put seed money requests, whichever one works. We'll accept both language there. So you just put advanced requests, and then you would put in today's date. And then under vendor, you can just say advance. And then under payment type, you would select seed money, and that's really important, so it's seed money. And then in the requested amount, you would just put in the full amount of funds that you're receiving, or that you're requesting in advance for. And again, that full amount of funds should just be for the next 3 months of expenses. So anything that you estimate you're going to purchase within 3 months, that's what it should be for, not the entire grant. Now, if you're doing a summer program and all of your expenses will be incurred within a 2-month period of time because you're getting ready to do a summer program, it might be all of your expenses, but really it's more important just to have within 3 months of expenses requested there. So when initially submitting this advance request, you will not need to provide any of the backup documentation. So instead of providing the backup documentation here, there's a different form that we want you to pay or want you to complete and upload here. And this is actually found in our Argo 2020 resources section here. So I'm actually going to open that up to show you. And it's listed under the Co-op Grant Program resources. There is a seed money request form that you will need to fill out. And this is required. If you forget to upload this form, we'll actually shoot this request back to you and make you fill out the form. So you'll need to include the dollar of funding that you're requesting in advance for, list your organization's name, and then sign and date. And then you will actually upload that document into this documentation area and then make sure to hit save. Once all of that information is provided, then you can go ahead and hover over the status change button and go to submitted. Once that's submitted, then we will process that seed money request or that advance request. We use that language interchange. So sometimes we call it seed money, sometimes we call it advance. They're the exact same thing. So once submitted, staff will process your request and you should receive the advance funding. Advances tend to get paid a little bit quicker because they don't have to review all of that backup documentation on the front end. But just keep in mind that you will have to also submit that backup documentation in order to fulfill that advance. And you'll need to submit that backup documentation before you can submit any future advances. So right in line, keep in mind that you can request multiple advance payment requests throughout the life of the grant, but you can't submit the next one until all backup documentation has been received and approved by our auditing team. Once you complete those purchases, you'll actually come back to this exact same screen here, and you'll delete all of this old information and the amount, and you'll actually come in and fill in all of the individual receipts and items. Just like you were to do with the reimbursement that I showed you how to do. So you'll actually come in on the back end and fill out this whole spreadsheet with all of the items that were actually purchased in advance. Once done so, then you will click Save. You'll upload all of that backup documentation just as before, and then you'll status change it to Submitted. If you need any assistance, we have a lot of resources to help you walk you through this process. So in our Argo resources section, actually I'm going to go back to just the general. It's not listed under the co-op, it's listed under awarded active project resources. We do have a step-by-step guide on how to submit a seed money request or how to submit a reimbursement request. There's screenshots and everything there, so that'll walk you through that entire process. Also, don't hesitate to contact grant staff if you have any issue at all. We can definitely help you through that process. All right, just a few more and then we are done. Let's talk about final payments. So the final payment request is due no later than 45 days after the period of performance ends. If you have completed activities and purchases before then, you can submit the final reimbursement and final program report sooner to close the grant early. All expenses and grant-related activities must be completed during the period of performance. So anything falling outside of that period of performance will be disallowed. If you have a large amount of funds remaining near the end of the grant period with no future activities planned, you may not purchase supplies to spend down remaining funds. While we encourage you to spend all the money available, all purchases must be linked to a grant-related activity within the period of performance. So supplies purchased solely for future events that are falling outside of the grants are not allowed. So if you have like one more event coming up and you're going to use those, you can go ahead and purchase a bunch of supplies for that. But if you don't have any more events and any future events fall outside of the period of performance, then we can't reimburse you for those items. And the last thing I wanted to say was be aware that our records retention policy is outlined in the program guidance document. You must retain all records relating to performance for the grant, including supporting fiscal documents and all your reporting documents in case you're selected for an audit. It doesn't happen that often, but it does happen. So all records must be retained for your organization for 4 years after the grant expiration date or until all audit matters are resolved, whichever is later. All right, and just a few tips to remember. Make sure to include all required documentation before submitting the request. If documents are not complete, you will experience delays in receiving your payment. While there is no absolute deadline for submitting payment requests other than the final reimbursement, it's highly recommended to submit payment requests on a quarterly basis if items were purchased during that quarter. This is to ensure that all grant spending is on track and we know that you're on track with your grant. Smaller payment requests are also easier for our auditors to process rather than a huge payment request with hundreds of items listed on there. When in doubt about purchasing a specific item, don't hesitate to contact grant staff. It's much better to know an item will be approved before the purchase is made rather than finding out it's disallowed and your organization is going to have to eat that cost. It's highly encouraged to spend all grant funds available. If significant money is remaining towards the grant, a scoring deduction may be in place on future grant proposals, as we've already talked about. And then sponsor contribution or sponsor match is not required for co-op grant funds. So if you listed sponsor costs in the proposed budget, we actually remove those from your budget and you're not required to report on any of those costs. And that is all I have. I know that was a ton of information crammed into 2.5 hours. And so I really appreciate you all taking the time to listen to this. And like we mentioned earlier, all of this information will be recorded and available. The PDF of the PowerPoint will be available as well as this recording. So now we're going to open it up. And if you have any questions, we're going to stay on until we've answered all of your questions. So unfortunately, we're going to keep you all on mute. So if you have any questions, please use the question link on the right-hand side of this portal.
Kylie, our first question is about receiving reimbursements for staff such as interns that receive a stipend and perhaps don't have a time card. Can you shed any light on how they would receive reimbursement for an intern or staff who receives a stipend and therefore doesn't have a time card?
Oh, that's a good question. And I'm going to say up front, I do not know the answer to that. I know that some sort of documentation will be required. I don't know if it'll be an invoice or just a simplified version of a timesheet. But what I will do is we can reach out to you and we can ask the auditors. So if anybody has that question, please just send us an email and we can contact you with our auditors who can provide that information up front. Sorry, I'm not an auditor, so I don't know all of those specifics offhand. And I've somehow never dealt with that in the past. So, but we will definitely put you in contact with an auditor who can provide more information.
Hi, everybody. I wanted to address a question that came up, and I'm sure a lot of you will have this question in the next couple of months. And the question was, are you able to have an advance request and a reimbursement request submitted at the same time? The answer is no, but here's why. You wouldn't want to do that. You would want to submit your advance request first, okay, and get your money. And then whatever you would be asking for in a reimbursement, assuming that you're within the period of performance, which started on March the 1st, and assuming it's eligible expenses involved, you could then apply those funds towards those things that you had as eligible expenses. Once you've used up the money that you were advanced on those kinds of activities that fall within the project period, then that payment will close, and then you can submit your next reimbursement request. But you're not going to be able to ask for additional funding until you provided documented proof that you used all the advanced funding on eligible expenses that are within the period of performance of the project. Just wanted to clear that up.
Yeah, so just to clarify, you can only either have one sort of payment request, no matter what it is, at one time. So you cannot have both a reimbursement and an advance at the same time. And just so you guys know, that is Blake Powers. He's our system analyst. If you have any issues with Argo or you're having trouble navigating, that is Blake. He's also the person who created all of those videos for you in the resources section. So many of you have either already talked to Blake or will at some point. So please don't hesitate to contact Blake for anything.
All right, our next question, do we use the TPWD tax exempt form or our own organizational form? I think I can probably handle that one. Nonprofits would use their own tax exempt form, just as a church or a government organization would use. So we as an agency don't provide that tax exempt form. Your agency should have that for you when you purchase things. Next one.
So there's a question about how do you show proof of payment for personnel who are on salary but are receiving additional payment from grants? For instance, a classroom teacher who also serves as a chaperone for a weekend camping trips submits a timesheet for that extra duty, but gets paid all in one paycheck. Again, that might be a question I connect you with our auditors as well. They will just need to have that broken out somehow. So they'll need to have some sort of whatever documentation you would need for their regular pay, plus there would need to be some sort of line item there for that extra duty pay. I can't remember, my partner's a teacher and I can't remember how his are all broken out whenever there's extra duty pay, but I feel like it's a different line item. But in that case, I would actually recommend that you reach out to our auditors, or we can connect you with our auditors and they can tell you exactly what information is needed for that documentation. There's also a question about, must we wait to submit an advance request until your grant is active? And absolutely you do. And I'm so sorry, this has changed from previous years. It takes a little bit longer on the front end to set you up in our system. So we have to go through all these different hoops to set you up as a vendor with the state of Texas. So many of you have already provided your AP 152 and direct deposit documents up front. Once we receive those, we set you up as a vendor with a comptroller and with the agency. And then we finalize your grant agreement. Some of you have already got your grant agreements back for signature. Then you provide those signatures and return those back to us. Once we receive your signed grant agreement, then we have to create a purchase order for your organization on the back end. We just have a lot of steps. It's government. There's always a lot of steps there. And then that process can take about a week or so to really get to really get set up. It can take shorter amounts of time, but you will not be able to. So once we create a PO, then we'll actually move your project to the active status. And so you will not be able to request an advance payment until you are moved to that active status. There was also another question on asking how we define significant amount of unspent money left over. I will say that, if you have a couple $100 left over, that's not going to be a big deal. But if you're leaving $10,000, $15,000, if we're talking about thousands of dollars left over, there will be a grant deduction. And so, that isn't fully defined, but just if it's over $1,000, or if we're talking about thousands of dollars, there will be a grant deduction for future years. So just keep that in mind. Okay, and then there was a question about discount. If you're purchasing materials and there are quantity discounts, can you just do that all at once for the advance payment request?
So Sarah, you have to think about it this way. The advance is simply funding that you get in advance. And then you've got to provide proof of what you spent it on. And it all has to be eligible. And then once you've used up that amount, that particular advance request gets closed out, and you could then go request reimbursement for anything past that you've spent. So let's say you request an advance for $5,000 because in your approved budget, you thought you were going to buy $5,000 worth of kayaks and you need those first. However, you go buy the kayaks and you only have to spend $4,000. That means that on that first advance request, you're going to have to provide $1,000 more of eligible expenses to prove that you spent that on those things. Once you've provided enough documentation that that's happened, you can then move forward to your next reimbursement request.
So there's also a question if native trees and native plants are close enough to not require an amendment for transfer from one item to another. So this might be a case-by-case thing. I would need to look at how it's written on your actual budget. But if you have native plants listed there and you ended up purchasing native trees, that's totally fine. One other thing that I do want to mention for all projects, if you do have plant material, it all has to be native. We will not purchase non-native or invasive plants for your project. It all has to be native plants. So that is a requirement on our end. So I hope that answered your question, but if you have a specific question about how things are listed on your budget, you may want to reach out to us and I can walk you through yeah, that's okay, or maybe we can even make a little bit change before we get the grant agreement in. There's another question on if you can submit an amendment before the grant is active. If we're already going through the signature process, we can actually do a quick budget revision before. We wouldn't even need to go through the budget revision process. We could just go ahead and make a quick change on your budget. But if you've already gone through, if it's been signed by our director or if it's been signed by you, that grant agreement, then we'll need to wait till it's active to do an amendment request. There's a question about for stipends, if that would be better as an advance or reimbursement. Either way, it's going to look exactly the same. For stipends, no matter what you do, whether it's an advance or reimbursement, you're going to have to show that backup documentation either on the front end or back end, depending if it's reimbursement or advance. So it's going to be the exact same on either way. And then I just want to scroll up to see if there's any other questions we have not answered here. There is a question on how to document salary. Again, you will need a work record or a timesheet, same language, for all personnel listed. If it's an independent contractor, you'll need an invoice from that independent contractor. But for all salary, whether it's part-time, full-time, hourly, salary, you will need that timesheet that has all of the requested information, and that is detailed in the program guidance document. But if you have any questions, some groups like to say, hey, this is how our timesheet is listed here. Can you just tell me if that will be approved? By all means, feel free to send us like a template of what your timesheet looks like, and our auditors can confirm if that will collect all the required information for you. So feel free to just send us what you have or ask any questions on if it'll work, and we'll connect you with the auditors and they will tell you if that will work or not. All right, again, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat now or contact us after the event. If you do not have any questions, that is all we have for you today. You can go ahead and sign off. Again, we'll stick around in the chat for a few more minutes to answer any questions that are here, but if you have everything that you need, I want to first congratulate all of you on receiving a co-op grant this year. For both all of you, the people that are new to co-op and everybody who's received grants before, congratulations again. I know it's a lot of work to apply for these grants, so yay, we can't wait to support the wonderful program that you're doing. We'd love to see pictures when you're doing your reporting, so always send us pictures. That's the fun part. Jessica and I might also be reaching out to you to do some fun site visits, not just nasty site visits when something is wrong, but we love to come out and see your project when you're doing camping programs or kayaking programs throughout the year. So if you have any events that you want to invite us out to that you're like, hey, you guys should come out and check this out, by all means, send those events our way. Again, please don't hesitate to contact us with any questions you might have. We're here to help you. Jessica and my job is here to help you. For now, go ahead and include both Jessica and myself for the grants. You might get assigned one of us specifically to be your primary point of contact, but we'll communicate that with you throughout the grant. So again, that's all the questions I have on here. Thank you again. You can go ahead and leave if you don't have anything else. We're going to stick around for just a few more minutes to answer any lingering questions.
Thank you. Thanks, y'all. It's been great talking to so many of you. Reach out if you need anything.
So there is a question on if you must pay a park fee 6 months in advance in order to hold a site, when can you submit the actual reimbursement for that expense? And the answer is whenever you actually made that payment. So if you needed to reserve a site that you're not actually going camping for 6 months down the line, but you needed to purchase now, you can go ahead and submit a reimbursement for that expense, even if that activity has not taken place yet. I know, especially with our park reservation system, I mean, especially with group campsites and all of that, you have to do that well in advance. So we will actually pay for that once that expense is actually incurred. So once you make that expense, you can go ahead and seek reimbursement or get an advance for that expense.
All right, last call for burning questions during this workshop. And remember, you can always follow up by email.
All right, well, I don't see any other questions coming through in the box. So at that point, I think we're gonna go ahead and wrap up this webinar. Again, thank you all for attending. If you have any questions, just feel free to give Jessica or myself a shout. Our contact information is listed here. So thank you all so much for sitting through 2.5 hours of deep grant information. So I know it's not the most exciting thing, but we appreciate your time. And so we're going to go ahead and shut down the webinar. If you have any questions, feel free to give us a shout afterwards. Thank you all so much. It was really great speaking with all of you.